Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve, on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue during the month of Ramadan, where we discuss research relevant to our lives today. And today in our studio we have Professor Junaid Quadri, who teaches history in the Center for the Study of Contemporary Muslim Societies at Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. He can be described as a historian of Islamic thought, in particular Islamic law, and especially its development in the Muslim encounter with modernity. He tells an intriguing story of intellectual movement and positioning that complicates our understanding of the formation of Muslim modernity. Welcome to the studio, Junaid, and glad to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin with a question. Is there a difference between being a scholar of Islamic law and a historian of Islamic law?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think there is, of course, a long-standing tradition of scholars of Islamic law, who in Arabic and, of course, in other Muslim languages we call the ulama, who have had a long-standing impact and important role historically within Muslim communities. I think what I want to suggest is my role as a historian of Islamic law, although in many ways draws upon similar materials, tries to do different things with it. So I'm very interested in what precisely happens to Islamic law, in my case, in the colonial period, in the 19th century, and even into the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. But of course, the questions that ulama, or scholars of Islamic law, as you put it, ask, tend to be of the variety of trying to give guidance in terms of behavior and doctrine to Muslims. The historian of Islamic law, I think, tries to do something else. He or she tries to use the materials that Islamic law gives them, books of fiqh, books of legal theory, books of jurisprudence, and to come up with analyses in some instances, or to come up with some account or story of what precisely Islamic law is and does in a Muslim community. That is to say, he or she is less interested in answering the question about what is right or what is just or what is appropriate to believe, but rather trying to answer questions that try to depict what Muslim society might have looked like throughout the history of Islam itself.
Can there be a difference then between a historian of Islamic law and a Muslim historian of Islamic law?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think in both cases, if you will, the way I understand the term historian, both figures are trying to paint a story, paint a picture rather, or give a story, or give an account of what the history of Islamic law is. Now, I think you ask an important question about what goes into history itself. And perhaps what you're pointing at, although it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that just because someone is a Muslim, that this will necessarily follow, but perhaps what you're pointing at is the way that our sometimes unreflective or sometimes very well thought through commitments that pre-exist or that exist before our historical work or intellectual work of any kind impact the conclusions or the findings of that work. And so it may be that the Muslim historian of Islamic law adds something that others may not. It may be that they take up particular questions, the Muslim historians of Islamic law, that is, take up particular questions that others may not. I think that's a rather wide open question. It's not a settled question, and it's really up to the individual historian to try to make sense of his or her subject of inquiry. So, just as in any field, the Muslim may bring certain things to their study that a non-Muslim may not. That can be good and bad, but it's important to kind of try to excavate those and figure out what the commitments are for a Muslim that may be different from those of a non-Muslim, or rather what the commitments for individual historians might be, how they might be different amongst them.
If ijtihad which is a big topic and a big problem of translation, if that can be understood as newness or new interpretation within Islamic law, then how does that activity of newness in relation to tradition differ from a historian's attempt at creativity in relation to the discipline of history?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. So, of course, ijtihad has been often used as a proxy for talking about innovation or newness, as you put it. And that has been a preoccupation not only of Muslim scholars, but also of non-Muslim scholars of Islamic law who have sought to find within the concept of ijtihad a way to grapple with new situations. And that is a characterization that has some credence, I think, within the text themselves. But of course, ijtihad has been a larger term within Islamic law. Perhaps we can talk about it in an upcoming question, which had to do with the exertion of a specific kind of effort, to arrive at a conclusion. So, when put in this kind of very broad formula, the historian is essentially trying to exert effort to try to come at a conclusion, the best given the data that he or she has, to come up with the best formulation of what the past looked like. Of course, their ends are very different. The mujtahid is trying to come up with a conclusion on a point of law, to try to direct people to act in particular ways, or to try to direct them to act in the right way, more precisely. And the historian is trying to come up with the right, or the most just account of what the past looked like. And this is something, I'm teaching, for example, a course this semester on history and historiography. Historiography as the study of how history should be done. As we've discovered with my students, there is no clear answer to what constitutes a precise, a most accurate, a most appropriate, a most right, if you will, account or story of the past. Rather, what we do is we emphasize certain things and then de-emphasize certain things as a result of both our personal predilections, but also because we have specific goals in mind, or we have specific, to go back to the previous questions, specific unreflective commitments that we come to our subjects with.
So given the formulation that you try to give about the recent past, which is before what you call the period of modernity, what was the impact of modernity on Islamic society such that Islamic authority perhaps changed its form?
So I guess one thing I should say that is embedded in the question, and I think may need some unpacking for our listeners also, is that modernity often gets described in a variety of different ways, as you know. Modernity may be thought of in many different formulations. So for some, modernity is about certain kind of political institutions, about democracy and human rights. They may be about a certain type of economic arrangement, so capitalism, for example. They may be about
technology, for example.
Technology, absolutely. The emergence of, specific kinds of technologies. So I think all of those things could be very defensible formulations of what modernity looks like. And I have particular, in my own work, I try to figure out what, for me, again, important understandings of modernity may have caused certain shifts within the Muslim world.
Was the impact of modernity on Islamic authority? Did it change its form?
Right.
In any way?
Of course, these same figures who I talked about before, the ulama or the fuqaha, were important bearers of authority within the Muslim world. Of course, one can pinpoint different kinds of authority, and so political authority rested often with other figures, political authority in a very narrow sense of the word, rested with others, leaders, sultans, caliphs, etc. But a certain kind of authority, a certain kind of authority or license to interpret in particular ways, or a license to guide the community in particular ways, a certain type of charismatic authority, if you will, often resided in a variety of figures, but prominent among them were the ulama. And, the ulama, because of this prestige that they had, often played important functions, or carried out, I should say, important functions within the community. So modernity, as it might be understood, if you understand modernity as bound up with a colonial experience in many parts of the Muslim world, I think one might say the majority of the Muslim world has had some sort of colonial experience. That is an experience with European powers that came to Muslim lands in order to exert both political but also economic, all sorts of diplomatic and social pressure. If modernity is understood, especially within that context, one witnesses in the colonial period a certain set of shifts that happen with respect to who precisely gets to be understood as authoritative. These happen in a variety of different ways, but one of the important things that happen is the emergence, especially of modernizing states, means that the state comes to occupy an increasingly important role, in many cases taking up functions that were the preserve of the ulama in times past. And so authority, as you can imagine, is starting to shift. So whereas the sorts of institutions of learning, both formal and informal, that ulama used to frequent, organize, patronize, are changing. And then, so there are all sorts of state institutions, state schools and colleges and universities and vocational institutes that come to occupy this role. And so learning, in this case, becomes an important marker of how the capital, the cultural capital, if you will, of a specific society is shifting in a variety of different directions. So ijtihad then, understood in a broad sense, not merely about what legal point to take up, but who precisely has the right to pronounce on what constitutes Islamic appropriateness or Islamic rightness or justice, comes to be occupied in other figures, not just ulama, but university educated, often very cosmopolitan, often with some sort of exposure to European learning, a figure that can exercise authority in a way that is now different than the sort of natural, long-standing way that the ulama often took it up. And so authority in the modern context, if you understand modern as a colonial context, is shifting towards a different type of person, and towards then a different set of ideas and different set of commitments, which mark departures from what the ulama might have understood authority to be in a pre-modern.
So these new figures, are they men of science?
They are. In many cases they are. Of course, so to go back to one of your original questions about what constitutes modernity, one of the important markers of a modern person, and we see that of course even today, is that he or she be a man of science, as you put it, and really often men, and not so much women, but certainly a person of science. And the reasons for that are many, but of course science comes to be understood, and I think has continued to be understood, both within the Muslim world and outside the Muslim world, and especially the Western world, as a sort of preeminent discipline. And this self-understanding of science as vanquishing other competitors. So in an ancient world, in a medieval world, including in the West, one would say that philosophy, for example, was an important, or perhaps the most important discipline. So to think about how to think and how to understand the world was the function of philosophy, and not so much of science. Science, as in the natural sciences, were folded into a conception of philosophy, which included them. With the coming of the scientific revolution in Europe, science, as a fully fledged independent discipline, comes to be much more important and comes to be much more independent, and in fact comes to monopolize what it means to know, what it means to have knowledge. So the person of science, not only again in Europe, but also in the Muslim world increasingly at a particular point, comes to be the person who one looks up to, who one learns from, and the commitments of science and the understandings that a worldview in which science is dominant also come to be dominant, and also come to be thought of as much more important.
And how does one understand science's impact on the conceptions of scholars who approach these questions in the period that you're interested in?
So I think we have a variety of different responses. So I don't want to be mistaken to say that science is there and everything else kind of falls by the wayside. I think that's not true. I think that there are points of resistance to that way of thinking about the world. But for a large part, one of the things I want to argue, for a large part, science comes to affect the way that what we might call indigenous fields of learning within Muslim society, such as theology and such as law, come themselves to be understood. So Muslims start to feel a need to respond to science, for example, in theology, by incorporating or at least responding to scientific premises within the field of law. You find this happening in India, for example, quite prominently, in which figures who have an awareness of both European scientific traditions and the philosophical traditions that are current in the period, which are themselves discoursing with science, feel the need to put those into discourse and exchange with theology, with the field that is known among Muslims as ilm al-kalam. So that's a clear trend that is happening in certain parts of the Muslim world. And also, as someone who studies Islamic law, I'm interested in sort of trying to find out what sorts of impact the emergence of science, and the emergence not only of science as a discipline, but also of technologies that themselves come up from science, come to structure the field of learning such that the ulama or the fuqaha then have to come to terms with. There are journals written, for example, in Lebanon and in Egypt, which are retellings of scientific journals in the West and scientific ideas in the West, written in Arabic, so that Muslims could then be exposed to them. In a context in which science comes to be more and more important, in which the telescope, for example, or the telegraph, or the telephone, all come to be technologies that one can look at and say, these are the accomplishments of a scientific worldview, it would be no surprise to imagine that these scientific worldviews also impact these indigenous fields of learning. That is, ulama and scholars of Islamic sciences are forced then to put themselves into conversation with these. And I think what I'm interested in is trying to figure out how science comes to be an accepted part of the worldview. That is, of course, Muslims have a long tradition of science, but particular ideas of what science is that emerge after the scientific revolution come to be central and important and need to be reckoned with.
In your description, you seem to, of course, be interested in how science and scientific thinking plays a role in the debates between groups of people in the time that you study. But usually the analysis given is about sociocultural struggle between classes of different people. Isn't your description somehow seems to give more credence to technological determinism? Technology, as you said, structures the field of learning.
Well, I think technology and the social impact of technology pushes learning in particular ways. I wouldn't say that it certainly determines how precisely the answers or the responses to science and technology are to proceed. But I do think, to a large extent, the emergence of very remarkable developments, it would be the equivalent. And I mean, I think now this is already becoming old. But if one thinks about what the internet does to people, one could understand what steamships and telegraphs and these sorts of things, what kind of impact they would have had at the time. So that technology actually pushes people to be much more sympathetic to what that technology comes from, which is a particular kind of view of science. And so I think that the technology doesn't determine what's happening, but it certainly makes one forces one to take it much more seriously in this late 19th century.
And where is the place of God and the Prophet in this?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Of course, this is a very old Muslim question about what precisely happens to the philosophical term is causality. Right? That is how precisely one understands the world, knowing that there is an omnipotent God, an all-powerful God that exists beyond the world. Muslim thinkers have come up with a variety of responses in response to this question. If one sees the world proceed in a certain way, caused by certain things in the world, that is, other things are caused by certain things in the world, then how exactly do we account for an omnipotent God? Muslim thinkers have come up with a variety of responses to them. Popular among them is the idea that God is still intervening in ways that are unseen to us, and those sorts of responses have been incorporated into modern Muslim responses as well, so that the role of God remains the role of an omnipotent God. This may raise certain philosophical questions, but these are philosophical questions that are rather complex but have been dealt with at great length.
And the miracle of the Prophet?
And of course, miracles in general, not just the miracle of the Prophet, are thought to be a rupture, right? An intervention in the world from the world beyond that disrupts the natural order of things, right? So miracles precisely are those things which don't follow physical rules, which are in fact disruptions of a physical rule. So for Muslims, that was explained by saying that God, of course, can intervene in the world when He wishes, as He wishes, and that sort of thing has not, to my knowledge at least, changed so much in the modern context.
Thank you for your time and helping us think through Islam and modernity and many of the issues and intricacies around the subject. To all our listeners, Ramadan Kareem. And if you would like to wish our listeners goodbye in Ramadan Kareem as well.
Ramadan Kareem to you and to everyone else. Thank you for having me.
A special thanks to Ehab al-Sheikh for bringing this program to you. And stay tuned for our next program in this series of discussions about research. Goodbye then.